Hello, friends. Welcome to the Tech Talk show today. The last time on the Tech Talk, we compared between Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Today, we're going to be touching on some of the big data analysis tools on Azure. And I have Andrew Brust with me today to help out. Hi, Andrew, and welcome.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Do you mind to tell my audience just a little bit about you?
Yeah, no, I don't mind at all. Happy to. The short version is that I'm kind of involved in all things data. My own company, Blue Badge Insights, focuses on working with companies in the data space and helping them out with strategy and competitive analysis, and oftentimes developing certain marketing content. I do a lot of analyst work as well for a company called GigaOM. I write about data for two different online news outlets. One is VentureBeat, and the other one is a more developer-oriented one called The New Stack. Um, I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. I'm also a Microsoft regional director. That's a program I've been involved with now for 20 years. And I'm a co-chair of a conference series called Visual Studio Live.
Let's start off with telling us a little bit about big data. So, what is big data, and what tools do we have up on Azure to help us with big data analytics?
Right. Well, I mean, some people are tempted to define big data by an actual quantified volume of data. And the problem with those definitions, of course, is that they always shift, because what seems big today may seem kind of average tomorrow. If you forced me, though, I would say big data involves working with data volumes in the hundreds of terabytes and then into petabytes after that. Um, but more important, I think, really what big data is best defined by two different things. One is the kind of data. Instead of just looking at transactional data, where the granularity is things like orders or purchases or, um, gosh, I don't know, single visits to a website, things like that, we move on to more behavioral continuous data. So we're looking at clickstream. We're looking at all the different items that a customer looked at on their way to buying something. We're looking at data from sensors to understand which aisles in a physical store people were walking around in, for example. And in the case of enterprise activity, it could really be looking at every single communication and lots of other things that are granular. By the way, sensor data works in industrial settings as well. So looking at readings from machines on a manufacturing floor, that kind of thing. Basically, whenever you get to a volume of data that is simply too big or impractical to use operational databases with, then that's a hint that you're in the realm of big data. Um, and in fact, even the term big data is being used less and less now. We're starting just to call it data again, um, because the assumption is really, even if you don't sort of meet some threshold of data volume size today, you probably will soon, and you need to kind of you need to set up your infrastructure and your practices to anticipate that. In terms of what's up on Azure to help us with big data, there's lots and lots. I would say the big three are Synapse Analytics, HDInsight, and Azure Databricks. But also relevant, by the way, is Power BI. It's quite relevant. Azure Data Factory, Azure Data Explorer, Event Hubs for streaming data, and Azure Purview as well for data governance. That's in fact, it's not even branded Azure Purview anymore. It's now branded Microsoft Purview. So I should correct myself. but it is just like Power BI, even if it's not branded as Azure, it is uh, still quite relevant.
So you've mentioned these three tools: HDInsight, Databricks, and Synapse. So many of these services have overlapping functionalities, but I'm
Yes, they
sure
do.
there are times to use one over the other. So how do you know when to use one versus the other?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right about the overlap. In fact, all three of them use, in some way, shape, or form, use Apache Spark. So you can, there's so many things you can do in Spark that all of, you know, it's reasonable to say that all of those use cases could be done on any of the three services. Um, but really, what I would say is this: look for the things that distinguish each of the three and then see which one's most relevant. In the case of Synapse, Synapse is a lot of things, but one of the things it is the new brand for what was Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So if you're going to be doing true relational data warehousing based on SQL Server technology and the old SQL Server parallel data warehouse product, then you want to go to Synapse. If you want to use the full stack of open source data components, including things like Hadoop and Hive, and Apache Kafka, actually, they're all Apache. Apache Hadoop, Apache Hive, Apache Kafka, and what I would call a vanilla version of Spark, meaning one that's kind of very generic and comparable to the Spark instances you'd find everywhere else, then HDInsight would be where you want to go. It's the only Azure service, by the way, that really hosts any kind of managed solution for Apache Kafka, which is geared towards streaming data. And if you're going to be doing heavy duty data engineering and or machine learning, or if you just love Spark and Spark only, then go to Azure Databricks, because Databricks is completely built on sort of a commercial version of Spark. And the founders of Databricks were the creators of Apache Spark. So they all worked together at something called the AMP Lab at University of California, Berkeley. And then at some point they all left and founded Databricks. So if you're a Spark fanatic, Databricks is the place to go. The other thing, of course, is that Databricks exists on the other two clouds as well. So if you want to be multi-cloud or be building stuff that's very, very portable, then Databricks could also be a good choice.
Yes. So these tools, or some of them, I should say, help us with transformation of data. So can you please tell us why data transformation is necessary, first of all? And
Mhm.
if you can also walk us through what a typical data transformation is like.
Sure. Although I'm going to caveat that right at the beginning by saying there really isn't a typical one, but I'll try and give you a few classes of it. By the
Okay.
way, a lot of what we're talking about here is not new, right? Data warehousing and business intelligence go back more than 2 decades. Data warehousing really goes back almost to the beginning of relational databases, in fact. And data transformation and data integration were always required to set up a data warehousing implementation. We always had to do this, right? Because the whole premise of a data warehouse, for example, is that you're taking data from a number of different systems and you are conforming it and putting it together so that you can analyze all of it together. So in the old days, maybe you would have your ERP implementation, all of your accounting and your HR, for example. Then you also probably had a line of business application that maybe was developed in-house for doing orders and order processing and keeping track of the items you might be selling if that's the business you're in. And in most cases in those days we were looking at putting data from as many as 6 different systems together, or roughly half a dozen. So we still need to do that, but now we're at way more than 6, right? Because we've gone. There's so many reasons. Has been an explosion in the number and type of databases that are out there, but also all the software that we used to run on premises typically runs in the cloud, including the ERP stuff that I just mentioned. Um, Likewise, customer relation management, CRM, is usually cloud based, whether you're on Dynamics or Salesforce, for example. And all of these different applications that run in the cloud typically these days have APIs, right? And the ability, in effect, to act as data sources. And if what you're trying to do is get a composite view of your customer, then you're going to need to put all of that data together. And obviously, besides the fact that you might want to move somewhere all of it and have it physically together, which, by the way, isn't really necessary, but besides that, obviously, as you go from system to system to system, the schema of all their databases is going to be different. They're going to have different names for the same things. They're going to be normalizing things differently if they normalize at all. So it's going to be a mishmash of stuff. And so data transformation basically addresses that. It puts the data together. It restructures it. It summarizes it if you need to, right? You may have activity for sales that go down to a very granular level, but for your data warehouse, maybe you'll only need it at a summarized level. So for example, you might just need to see sales down to the level of a particular postal code and a particular date, and maybe for a particular product or product category, right? So that involves some summarization, and you would do that as well. We've always had this need. It's now magnified by orders of magnitude. And that's why. So how do you do these data pipelines? There's so many tools out there. Just on Azure, right? I can easily name you 2 things that are dedicated to this. One would be Azure Data Factory, right? And the other would be all the Power Query technology that's built into Power BI, and by the way, is also built into Power Apps and Excel as well. And so sometimes what you're doing is drag and drop design of orchestrations, what I call boxes and lines, right? Where you have a diagram of some sort, you're dragging shapes onto it, you're putting lines connecting things, and in each one of those shapes, you're defining, even if you're not writing code, you're defining a particular transformation that you might be doing. It could be something as simple as combining first name and last name. It could be, something a lot more complicated than that. It could be taking a date and blowing that out into year and quarter and month, because you might want to be summarizing that way. All those kinds of things are there. And plus, a lot of the data is going to be dirty, right? So you're going to need to clean it. You're going to need to look for null values and replace them. You're going to need to look for outlying values. You're going to need to look for maybe the same customer represented multiple times with slightly different spellings. You're going to need to dedupe all kinds of stuff like that. So you might be doing a visual kind of transformation package. And by the way, this started in the Microsoft world with SQL Server Information Services, which is also a data transformation product. In fact, its predecessor in SQL Server 7 was called DTS, Data Transformation Services, right? So we kind of come full circle. A lot of people write their own code, right? And you could do that in virtually any language. A lot of it is SQL based. These days, a lot of it is written in Python. Power Query itself, even though it's visual, it's actually generating code for you in a domain-specific language called M. M is in model, data model, for example. Uh, and there's a lot of SQL-based scripting, either active scripting, or there are now data transformation packages that let you kind of use an extended SQL grammar to define things kind of declaratively in terms of what the source is, what the destination is, and how you want things to run. There's a big package out there now called DBT, as in database transformation, and that's all SQL-based transformations. So again, there is really no typical because everybody likes to do it a different way. What I would say is that you should be using data integration platforms and visual stuff as much as you can, because this stuff eventually becomes very mission critical and it needs to run, and you need a lot of plumbing around it to deal with bugs and exception handling to make sure things are running resiliently. If all of that is handwritten code, you have a much bigger surface area to debug, and you have to write all that plumbing yourself. There's always going to be some stuff that requires custom code. So have the platforms do the boring stuff and leave your code for the interesting stuff, would be my general advice. And of course, we could speak for hours on this very topic, which is why I've been so long-winded. But we'll leave it there, I think.
So let's try
Right.
to wrap up now with resources, right? And
Uh-huh.
perhaps courses that people who are interested in data analysis or big data or data warehousing can learn from. So do
Right.
you mind to share a few of those? Yes.
Yeah. So the first one will be a shameless plug. I'm a Pluralsight author, and I have a few relevant courses up on Pluralsight. Some of them are very detailed, and some of them are very high level. So I have a course out there called Big Data: The Big Picture. Um, it's kind of at this point many years old, but it continues to be the most popular course that I have. So it must be resonating, and I guess I'll go ahead and recommend it. I also have a couple of courses that, and it may be a little odd for this audience, but I have a couple of courses on doing big data on, not on Azure, but on Amazon Web Services. One is a big picture course, so it's only 2 hours long, and it really is high level. And that's just called Big Data on AWS, the big picture. But then I have another one that goes into lots and lots of detailed demos with almost the same title, Big Data on Amazon Web Services, as opposed to saying AWS. The second of those courses, by the way, Big Data on AWS, the big picture, if you're interested in that, watch it now, because, and I'm not really in agreement with this decision, Pluralsight will be retiring that course at the end of the year due to its merger with a cloud-oriented training company called a Cloud Guru. So some of the cloud-oriented courses on the Pluralsight side are being retired. I'm hoping to remake that course in the other formats so that it can kind of live on. Um, you know, if you're using HDInsight, you're going to be using a bunch of open source technologies, and many of those same open source technologies exist on AWS in their Elastic MapReduce or EMR service. So while it may seem weird that I'm talking to a Microsoft-oriented audience about an AWS set of content, it's still quite applicable. Moving on, though, every vendor out there, virtually every vendor in the space, big vendors like Microsoft and Oracle and Amazon too, of course, and then more specialized vendors, let's say like Cloudera or Calibra, which is in the data catalog space. Each vendor has a what they like to call a university. So, you'll see Calibra University, or you'll see, for all the BI companies have this too. And they all have a ton of free content. And they have a goodly number of videos. In fact, you don't even need to go to their universities, because you can just go to YouTube and search there, because they all have YouTube channels. There's a ton of free content out there. And then coming back to the Microsoft world, the way I learned a lot of this stuff was by going through the documentations and the quick starts and the tutorials. So I recommend those highly. And for Databricks, by the way, a lot of that includes sample notebooks. So you can just upload those to Databricks and start running them. I also, I mentioned I'm a co-chair of Visual Studio Live. So I have a couple of courses that, or a couple of sessions that I focus on. One is actually focused on Synapse Analytics itself. One is focused on Power BI, and I also have one on Databricks. And I'll be speaking at the European SharePoint conference in Copenhagen at the end of November, doing a talk on Synapse Analytics there as well.
So it's been great having you talk and educate us about these data tools today on the Tech Talk Show. Any last word before we say bye-bye now?
Yeah, I would say, because I told you about the talks I give at VS Live. That is mostly for a developer audience, and I do find that in the mainstream developer audience, there's apprehension around big data and also just around BI and analytics in general. That a lot of developers feel like that's a skill set that like they don't have. They're not going to have. They don't self-identify as being competent in this area. And what I would like to say is that's nonsense. Development and analytics go hand in hand, or at least they should. There are even big data features in SQL Server. We're not at the point now where you have to have a completely different, unrelated skill set, where you have to change your operating system, where everything has to change. So I would say take a look at the tools that are very adjacent to the skill set that you already have. For example, not only does SQL Server have certain relevant features, but again, if you're going to be working with Synapse Analytics, it's based on SQL Server and T-SQL. In general, if you know any dialect of SQL, then you already know a lot of what's involved in big data. Big data started out being very averse to SQL, and that was not very smart of the companies in the space at that time, and it has completely changed. If you want to learn a new skill that, and you don't have it right now, I would encourage learning at least a little Python. It's very learnable, it's very readable, and there's an awful lot of sample code out there in there. If you know some Python, you can use that skill. It's really portable to lots and lots of different contexts. So while I was a C# guy and before that a Visual Basic guy, I would say Python has a lot of universal utility. That's it. Those are my words of wisdom.
So, all right. So this is where we're going to call it a wrap on today's episode of the Tech Talk. If you like this episode, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So on that note, it's a bye-bye now from myself and Andrew, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Excellent. Bye-bye.
Wow.